Hi, and welcome to this last live event of Queer Candy Film Fest, a panel titled Envisioning Queer Futures for Southwest Asia and North Africa. My name is Elmira Zarisa. I'm one of the co-producers of this festival and a co-founder of QTI Coalition of Color, which is organizing this festival. QTI Coalition of Color is a voluntary run network for BIPOC queers based in Cambridge, England. Before I introduce our chair, I would like to make acknowledgements and say a few words about Queer Candy Film Fest. I would like to start by thanking the Center for the Study of Global Human Movement and LGBTQ+ at CAM at the University of Cambridge and National Lottery for sponsoring this event. Thank you to our friends and partners at Queer Asia for supporting us through this festival and curating a film package for us. Thank you to Encompass Network for your help and collaboration. And last but not least, thank you to all the amazing panelists, guests, and everyone who has in different ways contributed to making this festival happen. When we initially made a call out for film submissions, we specified that we were looking for films from the Middle East. But as the production of this festival has been a learning process, we came to instead use the term SWANA, Southwest Asia and North Africa, to focus on this region from a decolonial, non-religious and non-Eurocentric perspective. We recognize that geographical boundaries will always bring separations and divides. And as the scope for the festival, they raise complex issues. Our selection of films include works made in countries with poor human and immigrant rights records, as well as works made in settler colonial, LGBTQI-phobic and misogynist contexts. We acknowledge that these production contexts remain deeply problematic. Therefore, we have selected films which intend to contribute to destabilizing, flattening narratives of the region. We recognize that we as festival producers are accountable for our programming and that any process of selection may lead to a lack of diversity in representation of experiences, be it representation of ethnic and racialized minorities in the region or the intersection of ability and queer identities. We realize that the complexity of queer SWANA identities cannot be represented by one single film festival, but we hope that Queer Candy helps to create nuances in the representation of some of these identities. As an integral part of this festival, we have had conversations and panels to bring forth these nuances. The following panel is approximately 1.5 hours. If you have any questions, you're welcome to post them in the QA section, which you find in your menu. A captioned recording of this webinar will be shared on our social media after the event. I have now the great pleasure to introduce to you Jade Pollard-Crowe, who will be chairing this distinguished panel of creatives, activists, and scholars. Jade is a queer, lesbian, British Jamaican artist and activist. She has a master's degree in gender, race, sexuality, and social justice obtained from the University of British Columbia. She has taught on arts-based activism in relation to AIDS and HIV, and arts activism as it relates to reproductive justice. Her work is concerned with evaluating the possibilities and limits of arts-based activism today, focusing on queer, racialized, feminist artists and activists in Britain. Thank you so much, Jade, for chairing this panel.
Thank you, Elmira, for that very generous introduction. And welcome to everybody who's tuning in. I'd like to start by thanking our esteemed guests today. Today with us, we have Ümit Ünal, who is a film director, writer and artist from Istanbul, but currently living in Glasgow. We have Ghadir al Shafie, who is a director of Aswat, a Palestinian Feminist Center for Gender and Sexual Freedoms. Aswat also operates Kooz Queer Film Festival in Palestine. Dr. Sima Shakhsari is an associate professor in the Department of Gender, Women's and Sexuality Studies in Minnesota. And finally, we have Celine Morad, who is a Lebanese filmmaker born and based in Beirut. And Selim additionally has a film in this festival, This Little Father Obsession. So these have been quite brief introductions from my perspective. However, through this Q&A that I'm going to be doing with our panelists, we will get to know more about them and their work. However, I would like to urge people tuning in to take the time to engage with their outputs and research them more. So our panel today, Imagining Queer Futures for Southwest Asia and North Africa, is primarily concerned with the direction SWANA activism in its many formulations should take, additionally giving consideration to futurity. Of course, even regionally, as people, our lived experience and understandings of identity, language, desires, and expression are extremely heterogeneous. And it would be great to think through with the expertise of our panelists, how we can meaningfully be united in difference and build coalitions. Very relevant to the festival, we will also examine the role film and art more broadly is playing within the SWANA regions and diaspora. And I think when we think about futurity, that does often mean addressing certain barriers that may come up, and certain issues and kind of boundaries that need to be met or crossed. And so hopefully those will be reflected in the questions that I ask. And as Elmira outlined, please do be dropping your own questions for our panelists into the Q&A function of this webinar. So as a departure, I would like to ask 3 open questions, and then I will be directing questions to our panelists. So as a departure, I thought it would be useful to briefly hear whether you feel you're seeing the conceptual grouping of Southwest Asia and North Africa as a productive space for collaborations and creative expressions for LGBTQ+ people. So if anyone would like to step up first, or I can direct the question. Okay, Ümit, could you please?
I'm from Turkey. And Turkey has always been in a limbo between East and West. This binary dictates itself in all the cultural, political, creative discussion for over 200 years. Are we Western or are we Eastern? Should we be Western? Should we take good parts of Western culture? What should we retain in our Eastern roots? Years ago, I was offered work in a Japanese film that was being made partly in Turkey, and they wanted me to write the Turkish dialogue for the film. And the logline of the film was the sun of the East and the crescent of the West. Crescent meaning us. Suddenly, from a different perspective, we were the West. So this grouping also gives me another fresh perspective, and I like it. But I also believe creative people are free from geography. Most of us live in our heads. We carry our homes in our heads too. Wherever we go, if we manage to go over the borders and visas and all, and we can stay alive, and if we manage to produce or work freely, we can call it home, I think.
Wow, that's a very hopeful and inspiring answer. I definitely think home is a transient concept for particularly queers of colour. So many of us, I think migration plays a big part in our lives. And actually, just to say, I think we just discussed this before the chat. When I use terms such as queer or LGBTQ+, I do understand that the application of these terms will differ depending on people's understandings and basically the geography of where they are. So thank you, Ümit, for that answer. Does anyone else have anything that they would like to share on this?
I can say a few words. Thank you, Jade, for this wonderful panel questions, set of questions that you have put together, and Elmira and Ramona and everybody else who has organized this fantastic film festival. I want to go back to what you asked, which is using SWANA, Southwest Asia and North Africa, and whether that is a productive way of thinking about solidarities and coalitions, queer in particular, queer coalitions. And I think, you know, the term which was actually suggested in the 90s was by a group of queer, at that point, people who organized as queer women and queer lesbians from Southwest Asia and North Africa in a book called Food for Our Grandmothers, edited by Joe Cody. And that was, in a sense, to take issue, as you said, with the colonial designations, or as Elmira said, colonial designations of the so-called Middle East, to think beyond the Orientalist ways of thinking of the vast region that has been kind of collapsed into this kind of you know, homogenizing ways of thinking about people and whatever languages, traditions. And I think, as you said, there is there's a vast difference in the way that people think about their lives, vast differences in histories of colonization. But I think while SWANA, the term refers to what was designated as this region as the Middle East, is just renaming it, but it has really creative potentials, I think, in ways that we can think about shared struggles. Right, some of us have similar histories of colonization. We have similar histories of nationalist movements, similar histories of, say, for example, the Arab Spring, and also have geopolitical relationships. For example, the struggle of the people of Palestine is connected to many struggles in other parts in the region. So I think in that sense, thinking about SWANA in relationship to queerness also is really important, because if we think about queerness, as Kathy Cohen in the 90s said, not as sexual identity, but as shared struggles, then we can think about the potential of SWANA queers as a way of thinking about how queerness can be reimagined to think about moving towards social justice, not just based on sexual identity, but based on, like I said, shared struggles. So I think, you know, the question you asked about SWANA and its potentiality, I think, you know, to me is a productive way of thinking about queerness in the region.
Thank you very much for that answer. It definitely is very hopeful for the rest of this panel. I'm glad to hear that. Yes, and I think what you touch upon in relation to queer is extremely important. I actually think about intersectionality as also incorporating, for example, struggle and the geography of where you are, as opposed to just, I'm Black, I'm queer, I'm a lesbian, actually everything else around that. I think you really, saliently addressed that. So thank you.
Jade, I would like to add, if I may, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. I am very delighted to be among this group of exceptional speakers. And thank you for giving visibility to Aswat and Kooz, our independent queer film festival. So to relate more specifically to your question, there's a lot of uncertainties today, you know, especially, you know, with this pandemic, but also with what's going on economically, politically, within the region of Israel, Palestine, and the normalization efforts that Israel is invested in, with this deal with the United Arab Emirates and then Bahrain, which has been considered one of the main sources of funding for some of the main productions, whether in Palestine or the region. So I think this whole new reality requires a new form of organizing around pinkwashing, and actually it's it's obliging us to rethink and redefine our relationship with the region. And I'm glad that SWANA offers a different alternative to the MENA, Middle Eastern North African definition, which is shrinking in so many ways for Palestinians, especially for Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
So today we are rethinking who are our allies in this new reality, and how can we try to bring more visibility and be proactive as opposed to being reactive to Israel's pinkwashing, but how can we go around that and reorganize and redefine what is our new form of activity against all these policies and how it's affecting us. I would like to give the example of Sura Film Festival, which is supposed to bring voices and productions from Middle East and North Africa, and their second edition, they gave great visibility to Israel. Israel was listed, and Israeli productions were listed among many other countries in the region, which was shocking to us, knowing that the people who are in charge of Sura Film Festival have pledged to anti-pinkwashing protocol. So, and we're invested in their activism. So I think this is creating new challenges for us as Palestinian in the region, but also there are new opportunities. We've been hearing a lot of, you said earlier, intersectionality. We've been hearing the voices of feminists and queers being merged, very, very vocal, as we have seen in Lebanon. Most recently, queer and feminist women are leading the revolution. So I think this is very hopeful for all of us, wherever we sit in this region, to be hopeful by these voices and these revolutionary inspirations that empower us. It gives me a great inspiration to see that queer and feminist women are, despite everything, despite the horrible challenges we are facing on all levels, are still leading the revolution and holding the front lines and giving voice to and uniting the national and social struggles so fiercely.
Well, Ghadir, thank you. I would say queer feminists always leading, everything. And actually, what you were talking about and the new struggles for Palestine is maybe not so new, but I have noticed as we're nearing the end of 2020, whether it's Zoom or universities, there's a lot of censorship happening to Palestinian speakers, whether it was Leila Khaled, or I think I signed some open letters around the censorship of Palestinian speakers in Canada being uninvited to university panels. And I think, and please feel free to add to this or contradict me here, but I think when I'm like, okay, Jade, you as a Black woman want to be in solidarity with Palestine, I think more radical action is needed. Instead of signing these open letters, what usually happens when we make an open letter and a statement, institutions respond with an open letter and a statement, basically excusing themselves. And I think we need to be holding the institutions that we maybe inhabit to higher account and thinking how we can work with Palestinians. Because, for example, in the University of British Columbia, where I did my master's, we did an emergency protest with a Palestinian student group when the US essentially said they were moving their embassy. And that felt like, our president was basically against, the president of the university was against the protest. But, I think that made it all the more powerful in a way. And I think maybe those of us who want to be allies need to be thinking more radically on how we can respond to what is happening. So thank you. And Selim, did you want to? Oh,
sorry.
Yeah.
Just a real quick point about what the example you brought, I think is really important when we're thinking about queer coalition building, the example that you brought, to make connections between militarization in Israel, Palestine, and militarization in the US or in Canada, and the way that the Black Lives Movement has been violently suppressed by the police, the militarized police. So these are the connections that we can also make in the way that we think about coalition building. Sorry to jump in, just wanted to
exactly. Thank you. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Jade, for inviting me to this panel as well. It's been a very weird year for Lebanon since 17th of October 2019 that we re-celebrated yesterday. We've passed by all kinds of lows, and it's still happening. So I'm happy to be able to listen to you and remove a bit. Move again the brain cells in my mind. So to answer you in a little pragmatic way, my experience was meeting LGBT filmmakers or people in the filmmaking business when I traveled with my film, whether it be Tunisia, that really was a welcoming country to the film, both in the post-production phase and in the projection afterwards, Egypt a bit. So I met people there, even if it were through dating apps, that created a desire to collaborate together. And it happened that one of them flew from Tunisia, and we worked on an edit of a project in Beirut. So the circuit of festivals helped me meet with other LGBTQ plus people that and this orientation helped us cross barriers easily. So it was normal to collaborate together and or dream of collaboration. But outside that, I haven't really flied or traveled abroad for long periods of time, and I did count on festivals to create contacts and nurture and try to dream of possible coming together. In Beirut, we feel right now we're very isolated, to say the truth. I don't know if I answered your question, but that was a bright point when I could go with my film and discuss it with an audience, and then connect with other desires of collaboration. But this is a bit stopped now, so we're in a darker place.
Yes, absolutely. No, thank you so much. You did answer it. And I think you elucidate on what the creative outputs that many of us have, what role that can take, because you are literally meeting people, and even whether it's through, as you say, dating or making connections or collaborations, I think often something more can come from that. And so thank you for that. Okay, so
I want to agree with what Mrs. Ghadir said about the revolution that we had. It was actually really led in big ways by queer women, and I remember lots of faces in my mind right now, and we were inspired by their courage. And actually we were very criticized by pro-establishment parties that accused all the revolution to be an F-word revolution.
Yes, I can imagine. I think that often gets waged against activism. I personally see it as empowering. Somebody says you're a social justice warrior or you're a strong, staunch feminist, I say actually I am. Yes. So thank you for adding that. Okay, so yeah, thank you for these wholesome answers. I thought as our next question. So those of us in the diaspora, we're often facing racism, xenophobia, Islamophobia, combined with feelings of displacement. These are very real and legitimate issues that affect our day-to-day lives. However, they may differ from the concerns held by populations across the SWANA regions. I think important to this point, US and Eurocentric experiences have a tendency to dominate how activism ensues and is in turn portrayed. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on how meaningful collaborations can occur between people in the diaspora and SWANA regions. And further, thinking about this relationship, are there any obstacles or notable successful ways of working that you yourself have encountered?
I think, what you mentioned in the beginning, Jade, in response to Ümit's intervention, this idea of the binary of home and diaspora, and how queering that could also mean unsettling that binary of home and diaspora in a sense, which means that this also binary of so-called West and East can be blurred, because those binaries are very much kind of constructions that we need to move beyond these notions of purity, of kind of East stuck in time, and then West as the bastion of progress. And I think, though it is really important to think about, when we are talking about collaborations, to think about the realities of people's lives in the SWANA region, whether it's in Iran with the sanctions, or the repression, state repression, and the way that any kind of collaboration between diaspora queer groups and queers in Iran could incriminate Iranian queers and basically make them vulnerable to state persecution. And so it needs to be very careful, right? That I see so much of this kind of, in a sense, entrepreneurship of queer organizations outside of Iran that happen at the expense of Iranian queers, right? Whether it's, refugee rights organizations, or whether it's queer organizations that kind of, by outing people in Iran, are making them more vulnerable rather than helping them. So I think it's really important to think about those dynamics, and also to be aware that for those of us who live in diaspora and may use notions of queerness, not to impose our understanding of sexuality or race or gender that have particular histories. For my case, for example, in the US, to impose those notions to Iran. And I'm not saying that notions of queerness in Iran do not exist, or people do not identify as queer or LGBTI. Of course, people don't live in a vacuum. There has been movement of information and bodies, and basically those identities are always being taken up and reimagined, but it doesn't mean that they mean the same thing in that context. So I think that is really important to think about the coalitional politics, to think about first, to have some humility for those of us who are in particular in first world locations, and also to learn to think about notions of queerness, sexuality, gender in the SWANA region as kind of epistemic, in a sense, locations, rather than where things like queer theory might actually emerge, rather than we exporting our notions of queerness or queer theory elsewhere. So I'm talking too much. I'll stop here.
No.
But
oh, I didn't think you were talking too much. No, not at all. Thank you. And I think what you're talking about is productive, and it, when we think about futurity, I think often these things can send us into paralysis, because people have a tendency to do this as opposed to move forward. And I think these considerations that you're bringing up, they, at least to my mind, they could allow us to actually be working together and to be considering where and listening to where each other are coming from, but certainly not kind of building hierarchies or anything like that. So thank you. Did anyone else have any thoughts?
Jade?
Yeah.
I totally agree with Sima. Thank you so much. And I would like to add that, in my view, displacement and alienation are among some of the most difficult and painful human experiences, be it that born out of migration in the search of a better life, forced displacement as a result of war or persecution, or escape from judgment in your own country. But I think that the sense of alienation does not only result from geographic displacement or alienation. Sometimes we can be changed with our own environment, our own surroundings, and it totally affects our behavior and connection and reconnection with our own environment. And I think that's why in the 4th edition of Kooz, we chose to highlight. The title was Migration, Displacement, and Alienation. We chose to shed light on some of the experiences of queer people within our region. Present films and productions that highlight the issue of sense of alienation in terms of body, sexuality, and gender, and the relationship that we form with ourselves as queer people, and the whole issue of safety and migration, when we seek safety within these surroundings, and sometimes we face other challenges or not feeling home again. So I think that for me personally, the experience of working with people in the diaspora, Palestinians in the diaspora, first of all, half of Palestinians today live in diaspora. There are around 12 million Palestinians around the world. 2 million live like myself inside the state of Israel. 4 million live under Israeli occupation, whether the West Bank, and 2 million are also besieged in Gaza, and 6 million live in refugee camps or in the region or in diaspora around the world. And for me, it has always been an empowering experience to meet fellow Palestinians in different places in the world, whether in the region or in the US or in Europe. And I think it also helped us to unite around the issue of Palestine. I think it allowed people to see the intersectionality between our queer, feminist, and national struggle, and unite the struggle actually into one monumental struggle against all forms of oppression. So we have seen people gathering around queer issues where, in fact, they had nothing to do with queer issues in the past. So I think it's been very empowering, and it's been extremely effective globally as well. We have seen people who gathered around BDS who are actually also concerned with queer issues. We have seen a lot of people in the West who in the past wanted to save Palestinian queers, but when we say thank you, but no thank you, we don't need savings as queers. We have managed to raise the bar within our own communities, but we do need your active solidarity to bring justice and freedom to all Palestinians. So I think that most efforts have been extremely rewarding in my experiences and the experiences of Aswat and queers in general. And I think that these collaborations are also almost most often initiated by people in the diaspora, because they do have the spaces and the resources to bring more visibility to our cause as Palestinian queers.
Well, thank you very much. I think what you and Sima are saying is extremely refreshing. As I sort of said, I think often, at least in my experience, there have been people feeling like maybe their voices are being erased, but I think what you two are pointing to is you are actually seeing collaborative ways of working. And actually, Ghadir, thank you for pointing out that often regionally, people can be feeling what they would maybe be feeling in the diaspora. And I think that's a really important consideration that we have to make. So thank you for that. Selim, did you have anything that you wanted to say, or are you okay with this?
I could just give you some anecdotes. I was visiting a dermatologist whom I always go to lately, and he's LGBT, and he was telling me I'm thinking of leaving the country, because all the groups that I studied medicine to help and to be there for are leaving the country recently, especially since the biggest explosion in the history of the world that is not nuclear that happened in the 4th of August. Lots of Lebanese youth are leaving the country, doctors, artists, and many of them belong to the LGBT community. And so for now, I don't see a collaboration that is happening soon between the diaspora and the people who decided to stay. I feel a big mass of immigration that's going to happen. It's not new to our country. We've been emigrating for centuries, and we have similar numbers, maybe like 10 million in Brazil and other millions in Africa, and all the Lebanese in Lebanon are 5 million. So we are passing through a difficult time, and I see the community here going backwards. Everybody speaks of a golden age around 2009, 2010 maximum. And then since then, it's becoming less free, less free. And as for collaborations, I had in mind a friend of mine who lives now in France who told me, please come with everyone else. Let's create here. There is not a lot to create anymore in Lebanon. I don't agree with her, but as I see it, people who leave the country now try to work their projects outside without really a possible going in and out back to the country. So the positive thing I would say is that I have a friend in London who has been there for 10 years and who always tells me, I want to come back to Lebanon and we should make a film about how we met. So if this happens one day, this could be one example of a collaboration between an experience outside Lebanon coming back and creating something with somebody here. But for now, I try to remember everything I could. I have no examples of that.
No, thank you. I think that what you are talking about, the difficulties, I do take on board that many places at the moment around the world are in extreme precarious states. And I think that, of course, although I'm thinking about like positive collaborations, I definitely do take on board that there are difficulties with it. It's not always possible. And I think that, well, I mean, if you do this film, I would definitely try and get them to put it in this film festival again.
Thank you.
Thank you. And maybe we can hear more about that. I have some questions for you about your filmmaking. So maybe we can hear more about that then. So yes, thank you everyone for attending to these questions. So actually leading on from this question, many of the selected films for this festival explore the difficulties that arise from embodying one's queer and/or trans identity while living in SWANA. Like, as an artist of Jamaican descent myself, I sometimes worried about furthering the damaging homo-nationalist and homo-imperialist narratives that persist. And I wonder if this is a concern you've had or perhaps actually overcome. And if so, could you please speak to this?
I grew up in 70s and 80s in Turkey in a climate where an almost Victorian hypocrisy ruled on everything about sex, where even the Q of queer was unheard of. We had very famous music figures who were gay, but when the military coup happened in 1980, all the gay singers were banned from stage and TV. I find notions of homo-nationalism or homo-imperialism very interesting, but I also think a concept like homo-nationalism may not completely apply to the Turkish context. As far as I'm concerned, pride marches and other ways of coming together in the West have sort of created its own norm. They're being supported by big companies. There are huge sponsors at play. They're like big festive events. Pride marches in Turkey had a festive character too, but they have always been political statements as well. That's just another example how the queer community is prevented from being integrated wholly into a nation state system. Where I come from, being gay or lesbian or trans means being in constant danger or threat, or being a target for mockery. In 2017, I was in the jury of Queerfest short film competition. A paper published the photos of the jury, putting us in the target. The film screenings were banned by the governor, but the festival organizers still wanted to go on with the competition and to give the awards. So we met in a museum as the jury while police waited at the door because there was an angry mob outside making sure the screenings were really cancelled. A TV series was forced to stop the production only very recently because it had a gay character. There's a ban on pride marches and any other LGBTQ activities. So I believe in Turkey, we have a long way to go before starting to discuss about homonationalism.
Thank you for that insight. And I will always say that pride is a protest. I'm certainly not interested in, I know exactly what you're talking about. You know, I mean, when I was in Canada, Justin Trudeau, who is extremely violent to Indigenous, Black, SWANA region, basically racialized people, marches in their pride, you know, and the banks are sponsoring absolutely everything. And it's certainly not something that I think embodies any kind of activism whatsoever. And yes, I think that what you're talking about is very important. We need to be mindful that in many parts of the world, yes, pride is still something which is very difficult to, or maybe it can't happen. And I think when I was thinking about this question, it's actually on something that Ghadir briefly touched upon in terms of like saviorism, because it's certainly something that I see here where they kind of design like, yeah, we need to be in like solidarity with Palestine, or we really need to do like let's ban all homophobic music in Jamaica without looking at the kind of economics around that and how it's going to really, really affect the country, and how it's a very like imperialist notion when there is J flag, or like, which is like on the ground in Jamaica, or like for example in Palestine there is Aswat. So when I was thinking about this question, I was thinking very much about kind of, I suppose, the West or global North tendency to want to step in and act almost as a saviour. But thank you for your answer. Did anybody else have anything that they wanted to add as an answer?
I can say, oh, Ghadir, did you want to say something? Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Thank you. No, I just wanted to reflect on that homonationalism is like in the context of Israel. We're very much aware of it. I mean, just before I wrote about it very, very clearly. And yeah, we've seen it in all the pinkwashing campaigns that's been going for the past decade or so. The Israeli flag and occupation forces with rainbow flags, along with the Israeli flag celebrating in Tel Aviv. So we're very much the images of homonationalism are very visible, and then the comparison with homonationalism in Canada and in America and how they inspire one another. In the past year or so, there has been a very interesting debate, very open and public vocal debate that has been going on within Palestinian society about sexual and gender rights and freedoms, which was the result of a few happenings. Some of them are very unfortunate. The first one, the stabbing of a trans Palestinian in Tel Aviv, proving that Tel Aviv can never be a gay haven for Palestinians, and then the drowning of the talented dancer artist Ayman Safiyi, who drowned in the shores of Haifa, and then the police forces did not invest any efforts in looking for him because he was Palestinian, and then there were some dispute about his burial because he was gay, and then a very famous tahina company in Nazareth donated money to an Israeli LGBT organization, and then there was a vote in the Israeli parliament on correction law to treat gay people, and then the Arab Joint Party, which is the largest coalition, failed to vote on that. So the debate was very public on all levels, on media level, on the political level, and the Palestinian street. So at the end of the protest, we organized a big march in the heart of Haifa. And what was interesting was that people were thought it was provocative to raise the Palestinian flag along with the rainbow flag, which, for many queer people, it was the first time they can be out there in the streets, both as queers and as Palestinian queers, because we don't really have gay pride, and we obviously boycott the Israeli gay prides that happen in Tel Aviv and elsewhere. So actually it created a very interesting, we're very much aware of homo-nationalism, but I think people were so, first of all, they were protesting because they were angry, and they were giving a platform to, express the intersectionality of now we're going against the system, against the forces of oppression, whether state oppression or social oppression, and asking for people to take a clear stance. And actually, I thought that the debate was very educational. It raised a lot of anger, but it also raised a lot of solidarity. And we have never seen such interactions clashing so fiercely and creating a genuine opportunity for real and lasting change with issues that were extremely tabooed. So within the past year, we have managed to break the taboo within Palestinian society around sexual and gender rights. And I think we have a very good opportunity to bring a shift in the discourse and bring it more from the margins to the center of conversation.
Wow. Thank you, Ghadir, for sharing that. Thank you very much. And could I ask, Sima, what was it that you wanted to share too?
Sure. I just wanted to add to what Ümit and Ghadir said, but before doing that, I just wanted to say that homo-nationalism, of course, is not one formula that can be applied everywhere or be modular. As Ümit said, the pride in Istanbul is very different than the pride in the US or Canada and many parts of Europe, of course. But also homo-nationalism is not quite the, this idea of queer nationalism. It's really, as Poir has coined this term, as you know, as kind of an assemblage that really also thinks about how certain iconic identities become the yardstick of progress in a sense, and everyone has to kind of, it becomes a measure of the progress of nation states. That's one part of it, but it's also, how certain queers, those who are kind of complicit with notions of capitalism or participate in these notions of what is a good citizen, and being in line with ideals of capitalism, are folded into life while others become disposable, right? It's often at the expense of others. And I'm thinking about how in Iran, for example, this idea of the question you asked, the reservations about how these films might be instrumentalized, by this kind of, for these homo-nationalist agendas. Some of the films that I saw in this festival are really good examples that people are making films about queerness in Iran, and they don't necessarily ask for or reproduce this idea of progress in the so-called West and backwardness or sheer violence. So they kind of point to the nuances. And these show, as you said, Jade, that there isn't this need for rescue. There are films that are made like that. Shima Hoshiar in Ajam Media Collective had an article comparing, for example, a film that came out of Iran, Facing Mirrors, which is about a trans man's life, to another film that was made in the US, Circumstances, and talks about how even the techniques of representation produce particular subjectivities. These two, very femme, very commercially attractive girls for a kind of gaze, the Orientalist gaze that sexualizes woman relationships and demonizes the father as, this kind of fundamentalist person. So this kind of, exactly the production of the deviant Muslim masculinity vis-a-vis this, the queer, in a sense, right? So, whereas Facing Mirrors really gets into the complexities. It doesn't glorify or it doesn't deny the repression by the state or within the families, but also talks about the nuances. That is, it's not that simple. And I think some of the films in this festival do that too, and I think that's really important. We can't just sit and say, well, the films are going to be used or our writing is going to be used by the homo-nationalists, but there is a way of doing this where one is neither becoming complicit in a sense. And sometimes it's hard. You produce something and it's used in ways that people want to instrumentalize it. But I think as your festival, the queer, I call it Gandhi, Queer Gandhi festival shows there are nuances that the filmmaker bring out that is not just about this, this notion of freedom versus oppression. So I think, the work that is being done in the region, whether it's Lebanon, whether it's Turkey, whether it's Palestine or Iran, show those nuances. And I think that's fantastic.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, you give a very good insight, actually, and that's actually something I hadn't considered. The fact that I think, yes, the very making of these films is already, I think, rewriting the common narrative, which is often kind of in circulation. So thank you so much for that. Okay, so in the interest of time, I'm going to start asking specific panelists questions. So I'm sorry, you've just spoken, Sima. My first one is for you. I wanted to ask you, thinking about migration, so you've undertaken some incredible initiatives and research concerning LGBTQ Iranian refugees, particularly in Turkey. And I wondered if you could speak a little bit about this, as I thought it may allow us to give consideration to the unique experiences and challenges queer and trans refugees face.
Sure, and I'll try to make this really quick because I think we are running out of time. So as you said, my work is on queer and trans Iranian refugee applicants in Turkey. So, during my research, I found out that queer and trans refugees who left Iran, the numbers increased substantially, in particular since 2010, and more recently even more so. And the narrative that the UNHCR, UN High Commission for Refugees, and other organizations that are doing kind of refugee advocacy, human rights groups have is that it's because of state repression in Iran. So there's no doubt that there's, of course, state repression in Iran, as there's everywhere, when it comes to queer and trans folks. But I actually found out that the extreme or the kind of surge in the numbers is exactly because of the economic sanctions. Since the tightening of economic sanctions in 2009, during Obama's administration, actually, a large number of Afghan refugees who lived in Iran, more than 3 million refugees who were in Iran, many of them left Iran because of the sanctions, the tightening of the sanctions, and the economic situation put pressure on the most vulnerable segments of the Iranian population, Afghan refugees, for example. And the Iranian state wasn't giving subsidies, or, there was a lot of xenophobia because, of course, when in times of crisis, refugees are often anywhere in the world are blamed for the economic ills. So a lot of Afghan refugees moved to Turkey asking for refugee status, and there was a huge backlog. And that meant that, well, of course, for the same reasons, many queer and trans folks who are working class, we are not talking about, middle upper class queer and trans folks in Iran, but many working class queer and trans people had to also leave Iran, and because of the economic pressures, because many people said, I don't have a future in Iran when I was talking to them. So in my work, what I'm trying to argue is that the refugee narrative often creates, again, this, oppression and homophobia, transphobia in the country of origin, and freedom in the host country. And Turkey, as in this between kind of place where UNHCR has offices, kind of shows how queer and trans people are, while they're under the protection of rights, they become disposable exactly in the name of rights. They, they don't have access to housing or to jobs. They can't work legally. So my work is writing about how this refugee narratives distort the realities of queer and trans people's lives, whether it is in Iran, they totally turn a blind eye on economic sanctions imposed on Iran that basically kills not just queer and trans people up slowly, but the whole Iranian population, and also the situation of queer and trans refugee lives in Turkey, where some people have been waiting for over 8 years for their resettlement in Canada or the US, exactly because of both the situation that is happening in Iran, and of course, Syria. So I'll stop there, but that is a kind of, that's my project on what I call the politics of rightful killing, making populations killable exactly in the name of rights.
Thank you. And actually, Sima, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself, and can you tell us, I mean, I've done some reading, but I'd like you to tell us some of your articles and your book.
Oh, sure. Really quickly, I have a few articles or book chapters, Killing Me Softly with Your Rights in Queer Necropolitics. I have The Queer Time of Death in the Journal of Sexuality, which talks actually is an ethnographic account of the situation of queer and trans Iranian refugees in Turkish satellite cities in kind of mostly Anatolia. And the book Politics of Rightful Killing is actually on a weblogos on the Iranian blogosphere, but I also focus on sexuality and gender and notions of civil society in the Iranian blogosphere, and how particular segments of the Iranian diaspora tap into the opportunities that are produced during the war on terror to produce particular kind of information about Iran, basically have claims of a democratic future for Iran, but these imaginations of this democratic future still remains very, in a sense, heteronormative, and excludes queers, includes particular kind of sanitized, normative, gay and lesbianness, but excludes basically those who are considered to be deviant and outside of the norms of what an exceptional and democratic future of Iran looks like. I don't want to take so much time. Thank you for asking these questions, but just an overview.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Sima, for that. And my next question is for Ghadir. And you have actually touched upon this a little bit, but I'm going to ask you to go into a bit more depth. Considering the ongoing role that pinkwashing plays in the Israeli project, both in the way of portraying itself as gay-friendly globally, but by extension democratic, Could you please speak about the activist interruption that Aswat is making for to this for queer Palestinian women? And can you touch upon the contribution of Kooz Film Festival?
Yes, Jade, certainly. Thank you very much. So basically, pinkwashing has been known globally as a tool to brand and rebrand Israel as relatively gay friendly, because of this is the image that it's trying to portray in order to divert the international attention from the gross violation and the policies and politics of occupation, settler colonialism, and apartheid that Israel has been using against all Palestinians, queers and non-queers alike. But it's also important to note that pinkwashing is actually a colonial tool that is constantly speaking in our name, keeping us at a disadvantage, affecting us personally and psychologically. My first experiences as a teenager in Tel Aviv, the first reaction of my Israeli friends was to try and change my name to an Israeli one so I can fit into their own definition of being gay. And for me, this has definitely forced me to go back home to my own city, because I felt to choose between a Palestinian or being a queer. And at the time, I have just started to question my sexuality, but I have been a Palestinian my entire life. So, so the whole notion of defining and redefining our sexuality or even our identity, it took me many years to reconcile my national identity with my sexual identity. Actually, it took me almost 10 years until I came to Aswat, and I realized that it was possible to be Palestinian and queer at the same time, and be okay with that. So, so pinkwashing is a colonial tool that is constantly trying to define us and not just brand Israel, but also create a certain image of the Palestinian queer, and constantly keeping us at a disadvantage by saying that all Arabs and all Palestinians and all Muslims are homophobic and backwards, and therefore we have to act as the savior of the Palestinian queer. So I think that going back to Aswat, I think that the main reason that Aswat established in order to provide safe, supportive, and empowering spaces for Palestinian queer women, as many of us were activists in other organizations that failed to address, you know, this. The different diverse identities. So Kooz, which is Aswat Queer Film Festival, it operates within our art and resistance in social change program, which actually gives platform to artists and film producers from the region and not just Palestine, in order to present their work and present a different story of the Palestinian Arab or queer from the region, different experiences, and also shed light on the experiences of queer women. We have the production of Waqfat Banat, which brings 23 narratives from the SWANA and MENA regions to talk about their personal, social, and political experiences as queer and trans women. And then Kooz is one platform that allows this interaction, and we hope that we certainly believe that cinema is a tool for self-expression and narration, and hope to inspire filmmakers to produce movies that reflect the diverse experiences of queer people in the region, and especially bring the stories of queer women. We are definitely working very hard to achieve this, and I think that cinema has the power to transcend social taboos and physical borders, reflect realities, and also imagine alternative futures. And this is exactly why we have Kooz, obviously this is also provide an alternative platform, because we always call for the international community, especially queer groups around the world and queer organizations, to boycott the Tel Aviv Film Festival, which is the propaganda machine for pinkwashing and the manufacturer of pinkwashing. So in addition to calling for boycott of the Tel Aviv Film Festival, which this year will be held in November, we also try to provide alternatives for people to present their work and create this open interaction and discourse whether within Palestine or with the region. We always bring films from the region of similar struggles that intersect with our struggle for justice and freedom.
Well, thank you so much for elaborating on this. And I think that's so important what you touch upon in terms of providing alternatives. It's kind of incredible that you're doing that, and I think it's true. I mean, I think it's a very reasonable demand when we demand that people either boycott or exit or stop something. I think it's great when we can then provide a platform to do something in a far more ethical context. So thank you for elaborating on how you're actually making that come to fruition. And actually, maybe Kooz is a good time for me to now ask our filmmakers some questions in relation to film. However, I would like to just ask people, if you do have questions, if you could please be dropping them into the Q&A, and QTI Coalition of Colour will be sorting them out so I can go through them at the end. Thank you. Okay, so to Ümit and Selim. So I wondered, this is quite a general question, and I'm just interested in your kind of instinctive responses. As film directors, like, what has been your approach to filming queer experience?
I still struggle with the meaning of the word queer. I'm actually taking a sort of a workshop right now that's happening from Berlin to try to get it more. But what's sure for me is that I was 13 once and I was feeling like I wanted to die. And I remember promising myself that I would make a movie, or maybe more than one, in which I could help younger generations not to pass by the same despair or distress that I passed through when I was a teenager myself. That's why I did some of the films I did, including This Little Father Obsession that is now in the program. But since that time, the world changed, and now you can find lots of support videos and content all over the internet, YouTube, etc. So I always re-question my place as a filmmaker. What do I really want to say? What does the world need from me? What does the queer world need from me? So it's actually a question that is still not resolved. So I try to listen to what I feel and notice experiences that maybe were not tackled in the specific way that I feel like addressing. That's the instinctive answer I have right now.
Thank you for answering that. And yeah, I think it's very insightful, definitely. Ümit, did you have anything you'd like to share too?
Yes, I started as a screenwriter, and like Selim, autobiographical element was almost always at the heart of my films. My first screenplay in 1986 was the story of my aunt, who was a severe case of bipolar. After a very brief marriage, she lived with her parents and her little daughter for years. She took her own life before she was 40, leaving a big impact for the whole family. I wrote about my relationship with her as a kid, how I saw her, an oppressed single mother, diminished into a house slave in her own mother's home. That film was quite successful. And after that, I became a screenwriter and wrote relatively big budget films for commercial cinema. But when I started directing my own films in 2001, I had a strong urge to go back. My aunt, in those years, my had turned into a cult classic for Turkish audience. I asked myself why it was loved and remembered all those years. I believe because it was a very raw story, dealing with my worst nightmares very intimately. So for my first film, I decided to leave all formulas, all ready recipes aside, and go back to my worst nightmares, go to the core, where it really hurts. None of the films I made, except for my aunt, directly sourced from my life, but the autobiographic element were always there. I wanted to make films outside the boundaries of commercial cinema. In Turkey, if you put an LGBT character into a film, you're out of commercial area anyway. In most Turkish films, gay characters are stereotypical, perceived from a homophobic view, turned into caricatures, side characters. There are very, very few examples where the main character is LGBTQ. Even then, there's a huge danger for them of being two-dimensional. I tried in my own way to create real gay characters. I put them in the lead of the story and tried to give them depth. I tried to look at our lives from a class perspective and show different angles of being gay in different classes in our society. So I had to work with very small budgets, usually taking over the role of the producer, because most producers found LGBT stories commercially very risky. I certainly didn't take any support from Ministry of Culture or TV channels.
Thank you. Well, I think you and Selim have both touched upon how pain and very difficult raw experiences can push us to create and actually create other avenues for future generations. And I think in the context of this panel and thinking about futurity, what you're talking about is film's capacity to do this. And I would actually like to just personally thank you both for sharing these difficult times. And I'm sure many, I mean, I don't want to make this about me, so I won't share anything, but I'm sure many people listening can relate on some level. So thank you for this. I also wanted to gain your perspectives. So I believe like a powerful aspect of art is I believe a powerful aspect of art is the ability to blur but further transcend the boundaries between reality and fiction. And I wondered what's your relationship to truth and storytelling?
Ümit, do you go first or I go first?
It's okay if you want to go first.
Okay. I will use this chance I have to tell you that I would really love to explore your work, and if there are any links available for previous films, I would be so glad to watch them. I personally love this blurring limit frontier between reality and fiction. I don't want to go now inside myself to know why do I love it, but it really is an inspiration always. I highly believe in truth. So I don't want to make films to make the spectator feel lost at the end, but I like him to feel lost or her throughout. So for example, I already did 2 fiction to non-fiction kind of films in which I die, my character dies. So when this happens inside both films, people would know that this is not to be taken seriously or literally, because actually I'm there, I'm the filmmaker, I did the film. But I like to play with life and death, possible, not possible, and merge actual people that do exist with their actual lives, with total mythical and weird stories happening. I'm still not there. I'm really in the beginning of this exploration, but there's always an element inside the film itself that shows the viewer that this is not to be believed, or I feel the keys in my films are inside the film itself, because if everything is blurry, then I would be adding blurriness to an already blurry world. So yeah.
Thank you. Ümit, do you have anything to add?
I believe storytellers are illusionists. Even the ones who talk about reality must create an illusion first. Like Tom Waits says, I tell you all my secrets, but I lie about my past. We are liars, but there is some truth in our lies. When I say my work is autobiographical, it is 100% true, but none of the things in my films really happened. They are a version of what really happened.
Wow, that's something to mull over, and I can see Selim nodding. So yeah, thank you. That's definitely interesting to think about. Reality and fiction and that blurring in between. So thank you so much. So I'm just going to see now. I think I did see that we do have some questions. So what advice would you recommend to queer people in different geographies and contexts when they are or we are having a psychological crisis?
Well, I can probably speak as a human. Whenever we have a psychological crisis or any type of crisis, we need, first of all, someone to support us, someone to listen to us, someone to empower us, someone to acknowledge that we exist. And it's okay to have this crisis at this moment. And it will be better once we try and deal with whatever is surrounding us. I think for most of our lives, we are alienated, isolated, we live in fear, we're surrounded by violence. And very often this violence becomes a norm. Mm-hmm. And this can result in a lot of psychological crisis throughout our lifetime. So I think it's important for us to have a safety network, a group of friends or allies, or especially now when we can't really communicate or meet in person, someone that we can address or talk to in case we fall apart, and we all fall apart at some point in our lives, and to make sure that there is someone out there who can listen attentively and understand, even though very often we feel helpless. Sometimes we get calls and cries for help from Gaza. Gazans have been besieged for more than a decade right now. There is absolutely no way for any of us to go into Gaza or offer any help, especially for queer and trans people. So sometimes just lending an ear and saying that you're there, even though on chat, just saying I'm here whenever you need, can be very meaningful. Sometimes can be life-changing and life-saving for some people. So always think about our humanity and how can we extend our hands and to the less unfortunate and to the most disadvantaged people around us or around the world.
Thank you, Ghadir, for sharing such sage advice. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add?
I would like to say that an encounter, a beautiful and deep and healing encounter is always welcome. It could be with a book, it could be with a film, but at the end of the day, the best encounter would be with a person. I personally had the chance to encounter healers, a psychologist along the way that were supportive to me, and sometimes friends as well. but in a difficult context, it would be tricky to choose or to know the right person to trust. So maybe sometimes throwing hints or from word to mouth, knowing who could be the right person to choose, because there's a way. It's not sometimes only one session, but a part of the path, or un bout de chemin, like they say in French, to pass with a person in order to feel better about ourselves, or it takes some time.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you also for sharing that with us, Selim. Okay, so I saw some other questions.
Okay, so we have a question from Riham Shabal. Thank you for a brilliant panel. A question to Selim. I absolutely loved your film. I was wondering if you could tell us more about the process of how you got your parents, especially your father, on board. There were very comical scenes as well as heartbreaking ones. I'm particularly interested in the scene where you're taking a family photo and your parents are in informal wear and you step out stark naked. Please tell us more about this scene, how you thought of it. Was any of it staged in terms of your father's reaction? Was it a way for you to force your father to confront your sexuality in all its truth and rawness? Thank you again.
Thank you, Riham, for your question. The whole film exists in the small place between the yes and the no of my parents. So if they had said totally no, the film would not exist. If they had said totally yes, there would be no point for the film to exist. So it all happened in this difficult space in which they were not totally against appearing in it, but they were not totally supportive of it. So it was a tight, painful, and difficult little space to work from. And I'm not sure I would do that again today. So it was really a point or a stage in my life where I was maybe provocative enough, or I was in pain enough to make this film. It's not the case anymore. As for the scene you mentioned, no, the reaction of my father is not staged. That's his actual reaction. I told that there's gonna be a family portrait scene, but I did not talk about what I was going to be wearing or non-wearing. So what's the point behind that? I actually follow forms in my mind. I get images. I felt like this is how it's supposed to be. That's how I wanted to appear and be authentic this time, because this was a kind of photo we used to take 20 years earlier when I was a very small kid. And the meaning came afterwards, whether from me on the editing or from people who watched the film, and that associated being physically nude with the fact of being psychologically transparent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Selim, for elaborating on that. We just said goodbye to Ümit. He now has another commitment. So thank you definitely, Ümit, for joining us. Elmira, would you mind reading the next question, please?
Sabiha Alush has written, hello everyone, tomorrow I'm teaching on masculinities, and part of the lesson is addressing the rise of the populist white victims rhetoric. For our filmmakers, which is Selim now, have you been encountering this new rhetoric as of late? And how do you work around it? And there is also a question for Sima, but we can take that after Selim.
I'm sorry, I feel limited. I did not really get the question, so so I don't think so.
Not to worry at all. And I think, you know, when we're asking questions specifically, of course, not all of our art addresses it. So that's not to worry at all. Elmira, can we perhaps have the next question for Sima?
How can I re-energize mentally and emotionally after teaching some difficult topics?
Thank you, Sabiha, for that question. Drink whiskey? No, that's basically after teaching. Sometimes I do need stiff drink, but honestly, I think talking to peers who do the same work has been helpful, and sometimes students, other students actually, if you're teaching difficult topics, in particular in universities that are mostly white, and you know, the level of understanding of thinking about issues that are difficult for those of us who you know, teach in US or European universities and are from SWANA region. I have in the past been talking about the violence of sanctions in Iran, and you know, the kind of having the personal in a sense pain and trauma from, for example, losing my sister to cancer because of the sanctions. I have broken into tears when thinking about the situation of queer and trans refugees, and what seems like an impossible situation. I have, you know, basically tried to also talk to students about it, and sometimes, you know, you'd be surprised with the way that students actually respond and engage with those questions. So self-care, I would say, in whatever way that you see appropriate, whether it is a stiff drink or cuddling with your cats, or you know, your loved ones, your communities, that you can basically vent to, and yeah, so it's, you know, that question I think is also a good question, because sometimes we think of teaching as this disembodied experience. It's not, because some of the issues are extremely difficult, and you know, the kind of affective element of teaching is something that we deal with, all of us in a sense deal with. So I don't have a prescriptive answer for me. These are the solutions, but I'm sure, you know, there are ways that you also have thought about this question when teaching. Sorry if I don't have a perfect response to that.
Thank you. Actually, I think you did give a very insightful answer. And I definitely never think of I never think of teaching as a cut-off or disembodied at all, actually. And actually, before we go on to the next question, I would just like to address the question that we kind of skipped, because I was just thinking about it. So for the person who's going to be teaching on masculinities, I was thinking, you know, what you could do is, there are scholars such as Ronaldo Walcott or E. Patrick Johnson who actually address like alternative masculinities, queer masculinities, Black masculinities, and perhaps actually focusing more on these as opposed to what you're addressing with your question, these kind of white victimhood masculinities might be a way forward. I don't know if that's helpful. So Elmira, would you mind going on to the next question?
Question to Selim. What are the narratives that you find particularly difficult to convince other artists, producers, collaborators of? How does this affect funding of your work?
I haven't particularly been faced with such a situation yet. I feel already all my work is a bit on the margin. All the LGBT questions I address are on the margin. Lately, I finished a trilogy on the nude body. So it's almost 3 films of no clothes. I just produced them all myself. So I did not even knock any door. I would take a salary of mine as a teacher and do those films. I think what's problematic in Lebanon, besides everything sexual and nudity, would be addressing religion in a non-orthodox way and speaking political topics in a difficult angle. For example, in Lebanon, it would be almost impossible or unimaginable to have, for example, an Israeli character in a film, that is not a total monster, or it is maybe now not easy to make a film critique that has a critique to the Hezbollah, or everything that creates, that disturbs one of the parties in Lebanon is very, very difficult to make. So actually we're facing a big censorship on both, on sexuality, politics, and religion in our country. So usually all the interesting films are either on the margin, self-produced, not shown in Lebanon, or deeply metaphorical and hidden inside stories that may mean something but not the other. So yeah, I hope I kind of gave some hints.
Thank you. I think you did. You did address the question, so thank you very much. Okay, so as we are, as Amira says, over time, I'd just like to go in with Sima, Ghadir, and then Selim as a closing. I thought if you could share what you feel is the most urgent and or important concept or concern for SWANA activism to attend to.
Jade, if I may, I think that, you know, through our work in activism, through our movement, and through our, these film festivals, we're trying to inspire. We're trying to inspire other film festivals like Mawjoudeen in Tunis, which also started operating a couple of years ago. We're trying to inspire filmmakers and producers to produce more. We're also trying to create this wave of empowerment also to queer and trans people who see these productions, who take part in these film festivals, and also inspire more people to create not just film festivals and productions, but opportunities for collaborations and joining our efforts for justice and freedom. So inspire, empower, and create so we can all move one step further towards freedom and justice.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Okay, Sima.
Sure, I was hoping that Selim would go next, but yeah, it's hard to follow what Ghadir said. That's really powerful, Ghadir. I would say, as someone who's an academic, but also tries to do activist work and also engage with artists in my work, what I see important is building coalitions that are not just based on limited notions of sexuality. So when we think about how we talk about queer liberation, we need to think about, for example, the question of Palestine. We need to think about the question of sanctions in Iran. We need to think about what's happening in Lebanon. We need to think about Black Lives Matter movement. We need to think about indigenous movements in North America. And, so I think the kind of coalitional politics that is not limited to just notions or prescribed notions of identity, sexual identities, but moves beyond that to think about social justice in a broad way, to make futures possible that are just, so and not limited to very liberal notions of queer liberation. So I would say forging coalitional politics that requires a lot of work and unlearning, and requires a lot of moving beyond prioritizing one's own concerns as the way to liberation. So I would say moving beyond identities and thinking, like I said, about geopolitics and shared struggles.
Well, thank you very much. And Selim, if I can just pose the question to you to close.
I would like to go to a different direction and say spiritually what we feel is most important. It depends on each person. Whenever you feel touched, in the revolution we had last year, at some point I wanted to take everybody for a day or two. Everybody was kissing in the street and taking pictures as reappropriating the public space. And I told my friend I would like to take a picture myself also with a man. And he said, no, not now. Let's not jeopardize this revolution. Let's not put the focus on this right now. We need to stay focused on our political demands, not on your particular little LGBTQ demands that that would take the revolution elsewhere, that would make it fail. I remember not taking this picture, but thinking afterwards, to each his fight. I mean, if you feel now what's more important is helping people that don't have a door anymore, or a roof to their houses because of the explosion, then that's the way to go. If you feel that even during this time, there's still queer activism to be done, because we don't want to build all the houses and then discover we woke up in a homophobic country. So if this should still go on, then make it go on. I feel it's a very personal and inner calling to everyone. At least that's how I see it.
Thank you. Well, three different, but also to my mind connected answers that are very inspiring. And I would like to thank all of the panelists for taking the time to educate us and for giving us so much to think on. Like I already, I had thought after this panel I'm going to like rest, but now I'm already like, what can I do? I need to like, you know, get into action. And so thank you so very much. As this has been such a phenomenal festival, I would just like to ask Elmira or Ramona, QTI Coalition of Colour, if they would like to say any closing remarks.
Thank you, Jade, and thank you to you all. I think, like Jade said, we have definitely been energized by this discussion. We have a lot of thinking to do, and we have lots of discussions, so I hope you all continue. And I just want to mention again that Selim's film is part of the festival. You have still a few hours to watch it. So we will post the link in the chat section. Unfortunately, we weren't able to screen Ümit's film, but hopefully we will be able to do that for our next festival. And thank you all for attending. And we're super grateful for your support. Salam and solidarity from Cambridge, and thank you.